Hi, everybody. I'm Amy Chester with Rebuild by Design. Nice to see you all, and thank you for coming, even though it's a beautiful day outside. We're really excited for tonight's program. When we started Rebuild by Design nearly 10 years ago, manage a retreat were words that no politician dared to say. Now terms like climate migration and housing mobility are being talked about in the halls of government, in the press, and at dinner tables. Communities around the world and in the US are suffering from climate events. In our recent report, Atlas of Disaster, we found that 90% of US counties had experienced a federal declaration disaster for a climate event between 2011 and 2021. And though government agencies and private entities are taking steps towards climate adaptation, it's not fast enough, nor do we have enough dollars allocated to invest in the type of infrastructure we need to keep communities safe. Rebuild's displacement research has found that in New York City, where I'm sitting right now, up to 40% of residents are at risk of primary or secondary displacement due to migration of residents from coastal edge to inland, many of whom would not have the resources to relocate without government intervention. We need to act now, and we need to do so by designing policies and infrastructure that responds to the community's unique needs. Jake Bittle's new book, The Great Displacement, tackles these issues by telling the stories of climate migration through real people, figuring out how to solve real issues. We want to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU, where we're sitting right now, the Climigration Network, TNC, NRDC, and the Climate Museum. The co-sponsors brought together resources that the audience can use to understand more on this topic. Please follow the QR code on the screen or look for the link in the chat to access those resources. And of course, we're really glad you came. Next slide. Based on the RSVPs to the invite for this event, our speakers tonight really need no introduction. They're both reporters covering the complex issues brought about by climate change in the United States. Christopher Flavelle, climate reporter for the New York Times, will be leading a conversation with Jake Bittle about Jake's new book, The Great Displacement. We hope to have time towards the end for a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A chat button. And also remember that it's only after the speakers answer the question will the question become visible to everyone else. So let's get started.
Thanks so much, Amy. I'm Christopher Flavelle. I'm on the climate team at the New York Times. I cover adaptation and sometimes climate migration. I'm thrilled to be talking to Jake Bittle. I assume everybody who's here already has devoured his book, but it is absolutely the most comprehensive accounting I've seen at this point of climate-related migration and displacement in the US. We're going to talk about the book and then have a broader conversation about managed retreats, climate displacement, climate migration, and whatever else comes up. So please do throw in some questions and we'll try and get to them at the end. Jake, let's start by setting the stage here. Give us an idea what makes climate displacement and climate migration uniquely important in a country where people move around a lot and the housing market is plagued by all kinds of inequities and miniature tragedies. What makes this type of displacements especially worthy of our attention and concern?
That's a really good question. I think that it's worth paying attention to climate displacement in the United States. Well, for two reasons. One is that I think that a lot of people in the US, maybe not the people on this call, but a lot of people generally, even if they're aware of climate change and care about it as an issue, they tend to think of it as something that, is either going to happen here in the distant future or it's happening already, but somewhere else, right? And the phrase climate migration, I think for most people conjures up, if it conjures up anything, conjures up, the image of somebody in Pakistan who loses their home when the flood submerges a third of the country, or somebody in a small island developing state, right, who has to leave because sea level rise is destroying the place that they're from. And part of what I was hoping to do with the book was just show that it doesn't necessarily look like we think, but there's already, basically like a de facto, if not in name, climate migration going on in the US. And I think that like when you're trying to design both climate adaptation policy and also when you're trying to design housing policy, it's really important to know that that's a main driver, that climate change itself is a main driver, even if we don't always think of it that way. I think the second reason, though, is that for exactly the reason that you mentioned, right? Like the housing market in the US and the questions about where people live are already so, they're so messed up. There's so much going on. It's very, very turbulent and very inequitable market. I think that it seems like across the board in the book, what I kind of concluded, or what was very, very clear from the outset, is that every time there's a disaster or a climate stress, it seems to intensify and exacerbate the existing disparities and the existing inequities in a given place, right? So whether that's a shortage of affordable housing or the legacy of, redlining or sort of racial covenants and where people could live, the history of a given place seems to affect a lot what happens when climate change occurs, right? So I think like the book, like it was I was going to use housing displacement as a lens to understand what climate change was doing to the United States, but then B, right, like I wanted to kind of use like climate change as a way of showing what's going on in our built environment and what's going on in the housing market, right? So sometimes there's these cracks that you don't really know are there until there's a big flood or there's a big, suddenly there's a big shortage of housing thanks to a fire. And then all of a sudden you say, oh, wow, we built in a really, really strange way. We built in places we shouldn't have. We've allowed this market to go into a tailspin, and now we're reaping the consequences thanks to this like climate shock. So that's kind of like the other reason, is I think it helps us understand things beyond climate change.
Yeah, it's a great point, right? I mean, I think we both know from our jobs, climate shocks tend not to happen in a vacuum, and they tend to sort of exacerbate and reveal existing problems. I want to start by asking about the question of agency, which is one that I find myself wrestling with as I spend time in communities that are going through climate shocks and displacements. It seems like two things could be true at once in different places, right? There's certainly places where there's a historical community. It's been there well longer than the climate shocks have become terrible, right? And those climate shocks are forcing people out of homes and communities they've got a long connection with. And in that case, I think it's appropriate. It makes sense to view people as not just victims, but people who've been were suffering through factors not of their making. But it seems like there's another type of situation where people are rushing into an area that maybe 20 years ago, the risks weren't clear, but now they are, right? Whether it's coastal Florida or fire-prone areas in California, areas where, sure, disclosure could be better, but it's not like it's a secret. So walk me through how we should think about the question of whether the people who are being displaced by these climate shocks have some degree of culpability for the situation they're in, or if we should just expect the government to help everyone as best it can.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think you made an interesting point, right, about the disclosure requirements, right? Like this comes up a lot when it comes to flooding, but and it would obviously be helpful if there was stronger disclosure laws in every state and they were universal for all perils. But that's obviously not the whole story, right? And there's, as like you said, it's pretty clear now that certain places face like perennial risk, and it's not just people who've already lived there. There's people who are coming in. But I think that like that kind of points to a structural feature of the housing market in those places, right? Which is the expectation, which is kind of baked in at a lot of levels in this country, which is like, if I buy a home, it's an investment, it should increase in value. And then later on, I will be able to sell it to somebody else, right? And like time and time again, when there's a hurricane, right? Like studies show that the housing values drop pretty precipitously right after the hurricane, but they rebound pretty soon after. So in the case of, sudden shocks like hurricanes and fires, I think there's for sure a kind of human nature bias at play where once it happens, it seems like it can't happen again. And people sort of delude themselves into thinking, well, that was a once in a century event. Then there's another thing which is a lot trickier, and I have a hard time kind of articulating it, where it seems like, if you move into an area where there's going to be a lot of sea level rise, for instance, or where it seems like there's going to be a pretty significant water deficit over the course of the next 50 years, but the market is functioning, is sort of humming like normal. Yes, you bear responsibility for deciding to move into that place, but also you're sort of being like deceived by the I think, sociologists sometimes call it the growth machine, right? Like the capacity of private sector driven society to kind of keep rebuilding and rebuilding and building and building. So you're sort of like, why wouldn't I think it was going to be okay to move to Miami? Everybody else is doing it, right? So there's a culpability there for sure, but it sort of seems like there's still another kind of like larger structural force at play. Do you know what I mean? Like, does that make any sense?
I mean, let's go to that larger structural force, right? I think as reporters, we tend to focus on individuals who are experiencing these changes. But of course, part of the story is government officials, right? And we'll get to the federal government in a minute. But sticking with local and state officials, do you see in the course of your reporting a shift in the way local officials are dealing with this? I mean, I've certainly noticed that when I go to towns in Florida or Louisiana or any other, red or purple state, they're not debating whether climate change is real. They're sort of talking about, okay, what can I do? And they seem serious, they seem engaged. But sometimes they seem like they're moving slowly. Do you get the sense that there's a shift among local officials about how to better protect people from these kinds of shocks?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, right? And I think there's a kind of, like you say, there's a certain inertia there. I mean, when I started working on the book in like 2020, I think from then to now, I notice a lot more officials in these like red and purple states. They'll at least volunteer the awareness that there's a problem, right? And that there's certain patterns of building that maybe are not so good. Maybe we don't want to build in the flood zone next time. Maybe those houses up in the hills, they're going to face a kind of perennial risk. But I think that because there's not a lot of avenues sometimes, especially when you're in an executive, like departmental position at a city or a county, you're not a legislator. You don't really have the power to set policy. There's not many avenues short of applying for grants, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, for them to make a significant change, right? And so I think a lot of times, like the biggest shift, and I think you're partially identifying, is one from, and I don't want to generalize about all officials because everyone says, a little bit differently, but some people say, well, yes, it's a problem, but the solution is kind of like 2 or 3 levels of government up at the federal level. We need a lot of money in order to make a material difference here. And that process, as you know, moves extremely slowly. So that's kind of like the general tenor lately. But yeah, it varies a lot of, I think, as between the different areas of the country and the different like perils that they're facing.
I was going to say this to later, but this is the perfect segue. Let's talk about federal policy, right? I mean, I commit to being torn on the Biden administration. On one level, it's done a lot on this stuff, right? You look at incredible amounts of money for climate resilience, pursuing risk rating 2.0 for NFIP, the relocation program through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a lot of firsts, a lot of sort of big steps. On the other hand, as Amy noted at the top, there's no national adaptation plan. I can't recall the last time I heard President Biden himself talk about sort of the harder choices of adaptation. And certainly when I talk to people who work in this field, I still get the same message I got when he came into office, which was a mix of hope and also frustration that there hasn't been more sort of devoted attention to adaptation and migration. What's your take on how much the federal government is doing now to address the challenges that you identified in the book?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one, right? Because like you said, there's a lot of firsts. There's also a lot of mosts ever, right? And it's a syntactically, it's kind of a deceptive statement, I think, for a lot of readers, because it's like, well, it is the most ever. And relative to history, it's quite big. But relative to need, which is really much more difficult to assess in a lot of cases, it's probably pretty small, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of, I think that the best, one of the more generous frameworks you could use is like that this is a kind of like early experimentation in the methods and best practices of climate adaptation, right? They have these grant programs, like you've reported on the BIA one as well, but FEMA and HUD have them too. And they're sort of saying, okay, well, let's see what's out there that people are already ready to do, that they'll apply and they get the money. And I think that we're going to see over the next 5 to 10 years, as those bills get out, we're going to see like a lot of successes and failures in terms of, well, does this work? What are the downstream effects of this? And in theory, right, those lessons could be used to inform a much, much larger scale and much sort of more comprehensive adaptation strategy, right? I think the problem is like, that doesn't seem like something that Congress has been interested in funding as such, right? It's easy to fund a grant program. It's not very controversial. People in red states tend to like it, but it's much more difficult to fund. Okay, well, let's give a huge amount of money, like something that's comparable to the DRF, like the FEMA pot of money, and let's see how we could use it without waiting for the states and the cities to find a project that's very specific and shovel ready. So I think that's the next step, and it's a really difficult one to take, right? Like you need Congress, you need a lot of planning. There's potential for political blowback if it seems like the government's picking winners and losers, geographically speaking. Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to hear whether you think that's the direction that we're heading in, or is that kind of like pie in the sky? Because that's what I kind of wonder about, right? Like, I think it's great. Everything that's happened, like you said, like it's the first, it's the most ever, and there's some really interesting stuff that gets funded and necessary stuff. But the question is like, what's next? And it's like, what should we do next? And what are we gonna do? What can we do next?
Yeah, look, thank God I'm not in a policymaking role.
Right, exactly.
But like if I were, I'd think I'd be looking at your book and think, okay, what are the problems that really federal policy isn't addressing yet? There was a great study / sort of framework that came out of Louisiana. Matt Sanders, who some of you know, did it, looking at sort of what's a more intelligent way that Louisiana can start planning for large scale migration and displacement from southern Louisiana further north. And it was great for a lot of reasons, but one of them was it looked really clearly at what the challenges were, and it looked at receiving communities, right? It said, we got to get ready. We got to anticipate where people go. Think of how those places need to change to welcome those people, and think of how we as a government can make that happen now. I sort of thought, boy, I bet other states will follow this model, and they didn't, right? And the federal government hasn't. I've yet to see sort of a broad scale discussion of those kinds of conversations that I've wondered is, it seems so obvious to us because we're not in that role, but could it just be that there's no political payoff in talking about, big climate migration? You're sort of acknowledging failure as a government. You're saying, look, I can't stop this. I can't protect my shoreline. So I might as well get ready for people to move, which maybe if you're elected doesn't sound like a winning message. But pivoting a little bit, I mean, that struck me in your book as well. So much of the success or failure of migration and displacement depends on the attitude and sort of the readiness of the receiving community. Did you sense in reporting this book that that's changing, that there's more, as we all sort of become more familiar with this lexicon, that people around the country are becoming more accepting and welcoming of people entering their communities because they've been pushed out from somewhere else?
And yeah, it is. That's a really, really good question, and it does seem like there's some evidence on both sides, right? Like in California, in Santa Rosa, where there's after the Tubbs fire in 2017, there was a lot of chaos as people got displaced, away from Santa Rosa immediately and towards sort of other towns in the vicinity, and the reactions seem to be relatively positive at the level of like emotions and psychology, given that, the arrival of people correlates with like a pretty significant rise in housing prices, right? Which is like not good for the existing residents. And then there's the other side, right? Where, after Katrina, if you had a 504 area code and you went to Houston, you couldn't even get, no one would respond if you applied for a job, right? They would just say, get out. So I think that there's some pretty disturbing signs in terms of what happens when an existing community gets suddenly, as they would perceive it, kind of beset by a large influx of people. But there's also a lot of stuff of like, I think people are starting to realize the magnitude of the crisis itself, and the extent to which it can really sneak up on communities where people don't really have culpability for living there and where they couldn't really have known the risk that they face. But I think just to go back to the federal policy on one point, like at the most general level, like for a receiving community, right? Like even once you go beyond, there's no disaster declaration for a community where a lot of people came there after disaster and housing costs went up. Maybe the social service net was strained, like what happened with the busing of migrants here to New York. Like there's no disaster declaration for that in most cases. It's not even always like explicitly or visibly related to a specific natural disaster. And it's difficult, there's no funding infrastructure for that, right? So I think that that's like on the point that you mentioned in terms of what the Biden administration has and hasn't done. That's a big question of, well, how do we even think about using federal dollars to address those needs? And we don't really think about that right now, at least that I'm aware of in a comprehensive way, because the system is not built for that kind of climate adaptation right now, even if we're doing another kind, starting to do it somewhat well.
The issue of busing migrants to New York and other cities, I think, is a great one. And it's maybe I'm going to use that to segue from the issue of receiving communities for domestic climate migration versus receiving communities for international migration. You make the point that the Biden administration early on looked at how it could make it easier for people to cross borders because they've been displaced by climate change. They haven't made obvious progress on that. Do you think, is it too much to hope, do you think, that as Americans experience more climate shocks themselves, that they'll become more welcoming of people from other countries who are being pushed out of their homes by climate shocks? Or are those two different things in the public mind?
No, I mean, I would like to think that it's not too much to hope, right? I think it might be, though, because, and that's only because the political debate around immigration has become so calcified and so toxic, and there's just been no, unlike with climate change, even the whole problem of carbon emissions, like there's just no legislative movement on it whatsoever. And it's like hard to imagine how there could be, because you can't use reconciliation for it. And so it's like, I'm not super optimistic that the potential of, large scale international climate migration would change people's, or even witnessing domestic migration would change people's attitudes, because I think once somebody comes over the southern border, I think in the mind of the public, unfortunately on all sides of the spectrum, they become an immigrant who is not really, what drove them here doesn't really matter so much as like the system of asylum and the wall and et cetera that they find themselves in. So yeah, this has come up a lot, and it would be really great if it could occasion a kind of like a rethinking of that. But it's just hard for me to be optimistic about it, even though in theory, like it would make sense.
Yeah, it's occurred to me that one of the sort of most important misconceptions that I think people have about adaptation is that you want to adapt. They confuse it with resilience. They'll think, right, let's be resilient, and if we have to move, something's gone wrong. Yeah. When in reality, as you know, often moving is the solution, right? The only way to keep a person or a family or a community safe. But as you note, when you apply sort of adaptation as migration to an international context, it just shuts down, because it's just so hard to imagine Americans really being receptive to large numbers of migrants. I want to shift to this point to what I think is one of the most, fascinating and important sections of the book, which is the prescriptions at the end. You do a great job gathering all this information about where things go wrong, and then at the end say, hey, this is what we could do differently if we want to address this. And the thing that you come down on with really remarkable clarity is the idea of housing and guaranteeing that all Americans have a right to housing, meaning that if your home or property are destroyed by a disaster, you can live somewhere else. Walk me through, in your words, the case for a right to housing as a big part of the solution to climate shocks and adaptation and displacement?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what you said at the beginning, right? The question of why is climate displacement, specifically important to think about, right? And there are reasons why it's important to think about, but there's also reasons why it's not, sui generis, like that different from other forms of housing displacement, and the consequences of it, the toll on people's psychological, financial health, they're relatively similar in a lot of cases. I think that when I started trying to think about, okay, how could we deal with the population of people who are going to lose their homes in disasters, right? You sort of start to think, okay, well, who lost their home in a disaster and who's been displaced by climate change? It's not just people whose homes have actually been, destroyed or blown up by a hurricane. It's also people who've been, priced out by rising insurance rates, or maybe, their town becomes the receiving community and they get priced out because they can't afford to keep renting there. And so you quickly start stacking these secondary and tertiary and quaternary effects. And I say, okay, well, how, like, the impacts of climate change, they reverberate through this existing really, really tumultuous housing market. And there's definitely targeted things you can do, right? Almost like means testing of housing assistance for people who, can show, okay, my home has been destroyed in a disaster, right? Like that's what FEMA does. You show, okay, I need this help for this reason, and they give it to you. But, if you really want to solve the problem of people just having a kind of chronic housing instability because of these climate risks, you kind of have to look at the housing market. And then you have a whole different set of interventions, many of which the US government has experimented with before, in terms of how do we make sure that everyone can afford housing, right? And so that looks like, right now it looks like housing vouchers, like the Section 8 program. In the past, it looked like social housing under the Public Housing Act. And there's a whole lot of options there, right? But I think it quickly becomes difficult to draw a bright line between people who've been displaced by climate disasters and people who've been displaced by not climate disasters just because they can't afford to live somewhere. And it's like, well, maybe we shouldn't draw that line anyway, but it's also really hard to draw that line. And so a comprehensive solution to the problem on one side of the line kind of involves like a full scale look at how we provide housing in this country, which, as everybody knows, is really, 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 really mucked up. Like it's just not working, right? So that's kind of like it's a back way in to solving this specific problem.
I think we've reached the point that comes up in every climate policy conversation where you identify things that should happen and might be, and then discuss the odds of them actually happening.
Right. I mean, it's easy to make prescriptions, right? Like the last chapter of the book was in many ways the easiest one to write, because all I had to do was say, well, here's how you might fix this. But it's pretty easy to do, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, but like, if there's a ray of hope or maybe a silver lining to what we cover, it's that as the shocks of climate change become harder to predict, more aggressive, faster, and more alarming, that maybe it begins to sort of unleash new possibilities politically, right? Maybe in response, voters and officials say, well, this thing that seemed out of the question before, maybe I'll look at it now. I'm reaching here, but did you sense in report in the book that kind of, the natural human response to worsening disasters is to think differently? Do you feel like that's happening?
I think that's happening in some cases, certainly. Yeah. And I think one example, it's not in the book, but it's really, really, to me, it was a really heartening example of how thinking can change on this issue, is the dams on the Klamath River, right? So there's these dams, they've been there forever, and the tribe has been trying to get them removed forever. But it took, I think, in a lot of ways, it took not only the specific sort of like whiplash cycle of water availability and scarcity on the Klamath and the vulnerability that posed for the salmon, but also just, I think, in general, the more that these disasters happen, the more people start to be a little more conscious about the way that we've chosen to relate to the environment, right? And the way that we've chosen to kind of impose human will on the environment, which is the reason for a lot of the risk, the housing risk that I'm identifying and that you're talking about, right? And so that awareness can kind of cause, I think, people to think differently and say, well, these dams have been here forever. We stop thinking that way and say, okay, let's take them down, right? Like let's get the salmon back up the river. And I think that kind of new thinking isn't really possible unless people see just how bad things can get. So there's definitely a silver lining. And I think it comes from us just kind of reevaluating the way that we relate.
Talk to tribal officials who will say, maybe the answer is not being so wedded to a particular plot of land and being more willing to move as needed. Obviously, that's an issue with a very loaded history for Native Americans, but sort of it raises the question for me of psychological adaptation, right? And changing our view on moving. Did you come across people who were philosophical about it and said, you know what, I'm going to miss my home, my community, but I'm willing to move on because that's what it takes. And I think I can build a better life somewhere else. I think we all have the idea of people who are climate displaced as suffering and losing something.
Oh, yeah.
Do they also, in many cases, perhaps gain something?
Definitely. And I think that the gains often are a little more intangible than the losses, right? Like I think a lot of people I spoke to could point to a specific kind of financial hardship that they'd endured after a disaster. But I think there's a strong psychological motivation to tell oneself, first of all, that an experience hasn't been for nothing, right? And that there's a silver lining. But I think also attachment to a specific place, that's a really powerful force for a lot of people. And in a lot of cases, it comes from family or history, culture. But I think in cases where people, they don't necessarily have, those bonds aren't the strongest, they just really like a place or that's where they've lived in the past, it does kind of open up new kind of vistas for them sometimes, right? And when I started working on the book, I'm sure this is probably the same for you, but this was not in my mind at all, right? Because I haven't experienced anything like this really personally. And I was like, well, like you said, they're suffering, they've been victimized. But then I was kind of surprised by how routinely people would say, yeah, like I really like it here, or man, it was difficult, but thank God, because then I met, my wife. So there's definitely like people's lives are so meandering, I think, in a lot of ways, that there's definitely potential for people to have productive outcomes, but there's a lot of, there's an abyss of economic pain and psychological pain in between most of the time.
I feel like this is the point in the conversation where we turn to our audience.
Mind if I ask you one question?
Oh yeah, please.
So, I think in the book, I sort of talk about managed retreat, and I talk about the ways in which it's kind of gone wrong or it's not been super successful. And I think one of the examples that probably everybody was familiar with is the Ile-de-Jean-Charles relocation in Louisiana, where it started out as the idea came from the tribe, but the progress of it was very controversial. I wonder if in reporting on the new BIA programs, the new Native American relocation programs, you got the sense that we're learning at all how to do this, and if there's lessons that policymakers are coming away with that are sort of changing our approach to this kind of whole community relocation.
I wish I could say yes. I would love to say yes, but I actually thought, I went down to Ile-de-Jean-Charles when that first started, and it went down a few times since. I thought it was a pretty promising approach.
Yeah.
Genuinely wanted to understand and try to meet the needs and desires of the community.
Oh, for sure.
Went off the rails here and there for a whole bunch of reasons, but it wasn't obvious to me that it was a sort of a lack of imagination. And I've asked BIA officials, hey, what did you learn from the Ile-de-Jean-Charles experience? And didn't really get an answer. So I have this sense, I'd love to be proven wrong here, but I have the sense that when the government comes in and tries to treat the community as a cohesive unit, you're never going to reach unanimity or even a strong degree of consensus. And the result is some people will be unhappy. I'm sure, and I think BIA is sure that there's still steps that could be taken by the government to do it better. But it's not clear to me that there's one thing or a few small things to fix. I feel like when you're moving a community, it's just a sad experience.
Yeah.
I wish the answer were rosier. But my sense is that there's an issue of sort of managing expectations about it, and it's just unclear how well it can go. But I hope to be wrong. We got a few questions coming in. I'm sort of just reading them in the order that they're appearing on my screen. I've got one question asking about the tension between adaptation, let's say that to include migration, and also cutting emissions. Is a classic question. I'm sure you come across this. Do we sort of undercut the push to reduce emissions by focusing on adaptation and migration as a solution? Is there a way to have, I'm reading here, a dual focus, especially when capacity is so limited? I mean, you take this. What's the answer to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really think that there's a zero sum of attention and potential will, even money, between those two things. I think that like maybe a few years ago, maybe a decade ago, it would have been fair to say, you could have argued that by talking about adaptation, you're sort of getting rid of the impetus to cut emissions. And I think sometimes people still, on the sort of like climate skeptic side, they'll still argue, well, we can just adapt. I see that in the Wall Street Journal opinion page a lot. But I don't think that that's really the case anymore. I think that the reason for that, right, is that the solutions to those problems, at least the way that the US has chosen to attack them, are so different in terms of the structure of the solution, right? So in the US, we've decided, or Congress seems to have decided, that the process of cutting emissions is kind of about revamping these big markets, right, for energy and automobiles, agriculture. Like we have to try to fix the way that these entities are producing things by giving them incentives and disincentives to do things certain ways. But that's not really the way that climate adaptation policy has been structured so far. We don't really rely on the private sector or, developers to like change the way that I think in a lot of cases so far, it's been like, okay, the government is going to try to fund these certain things, but we're not really going to try to create like a self-sustaining market. The government's kind of like the biggest game in town for adaptation. And I think there's a sense that this is a public sector problem where we need, governmental authorities to intervene and try to design policy. So I think there's like two separate tracks at this point, right? And you can spend a lot of money on cutting emissions, and you spend a different kind of money on adapting in a different way. Man, that was not a very coherent answer, but do you kind of see what I'm getting at? Like, I don't really think that they're competing for the same money or the same attention anymore.
Yeah, if I can just add an addendum to that,
please.
They might be competing for the attention of the same people in the White House.
That's possibly true. Yeah. I think you would probably know more about that than me, but yeah, I would be more than willing to believe that. And in fact, I think that I've always been told that the National Disaster Resilience Competition, the late Obama era thing, was in part the result of them having kind of hit the deck on Waxman-Markey and not really being able to find a way to. They tried the Clean Power Plan. They were like, okay, what else can we do, right? Like, and that was kind of, I mean, I don't know that for a fact, but that's what I've always been told was the genesis of that project in part. So I think that, there's an argument that like, they're definitely competing for the attention of policymakers, even if not the same, pots of money.
I'm going through the list here just as they come up. What are your views or observations on the role of institutional investors in the real estate sector? Are they understanding the risk, or are they part of the problem? Any key messages for investors?
I think that there's a lot of, even more so than in designing local policy, I think there's a lot of inertia on this, right? And I think that, as you probably know, the Federal Reserve is trying to test to these sort of stress test scenarios for banks and these events of climate shocks. Fannie and Freddie have started to get a little cagey about this, but I'm not aware that there's been a similar. I think that institutional investors have started to get pretty cagey about funding oil and gas, right? Like there's a lot of shareholder pressure. There's a lot of public pressure on divestment or engagement with, oil and gas. But on the adaptation risk, especially in the real estate sector, I don't think there's been that much of a sea change, in part because there's less public pressure, but also just because it's very difficult to assess the scale of the risk and the exact location of the risk for a lot of people. So I don't see that happening so much right now, but I think it's almost an inevitability that it will. just
Yeah.
given what's happening with the financial oversight, organs of the government.
Yeah, that seems right. I've got a question about language. It reads, instead of referring to climate change, wouldn't it be better to call it climate emergency, which would carry a stronger psychological impact with the public? I've 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 never been especially moved by that argument, but I don't know. Maybe that's come up for you.
Yeah, I don't, it's a tough one for me because every couple of years, it seems like, and this is not, I don't mean this to be flippant, like every few years, it seems like there's a new phrase. Climate crisis was one, climate emergency. And I have always had a hard time figuring out whether and to what extent using those words really does correlate with public awareness, or people saying they prioritize the issue, or even understanding the scale. And just when you think about how long people spent trying to talk about this in a way that would produce action, right? And then I think like in 2018, 2017, there was a series of just absolutely calamitous disasters. I think like most significantly, like the Camp Fire and the 2017 fires as well. And that was the point when I felt like people started to say to me, oh my God, this is really, really, really happening. And so those images, right, of like, there was an image of people golfing and there was fire in the background. I think that image, and as reporters who we both write, it's sort of, I don't want to say like a picture is worth 1,000 words, but I think in that those images were far more forceful than the specific terminology. So it's not to say that we're not in a climate emergency or we're not in a climate crisis, but I just don't know to what extent those really change people's psychology. That wasn't the way it happened for me, at least.
Yeah. I've got one from somebody asking about giant coastal defense programs.
Oh, like the Corps?
Yes. How should displacement policy think about the giant decades-long coastal defense programs being planned by the Corps for Houston? Maybe they mean the Ike Dike and York and New Jersey. It's such a wonderful point of contention, right? The people who hate these things hate them a lot, and the people who put the right idea like them a lot.
Yeah.
Jump in on that.
I mean, I love talking about this, and I love talking about the Corps because this exact thing that you mentioned, right? Where it's like it's extremely polarized discussion, and the projects are so huge, and they take so long to build, and they take even longer to evaluate how they're actually working, that it's really, really difficult to say I found it's really difficult to say anything with confidence about them sometimes. And that's because I think in part because all the information comes from these environmental impact statements and feasibility studies that the Corps does, which are, absolutely Byzantine, and they're difficult to wrap your mind around. Sometimes they don't seem like they're super connected to like tangible reality. In the case of the harbor and tributary study, though, the one in New York and the Ike Dike, there's a sense, I think, in which the Corps seems to be, and if you're listening and you're from the Corps, I'd love to talk about this. They seem to kind of be fighting the last war a little bit, where there were these big storm surge events, and the Corps has kind of designed these storm surge barriers on the theory that the best bang for your buck, if you're the federal government, is preventing these catastrophic storm surge events, which cause hundreds of billions of dollars of damage. But then, in the midst of this planning, right, like in 2021, there was the remnants of Ida hit New York, and there was this street flooding, this drainage problem, this sort of convective issue with all of this giant amount of rainwater fell in 2 hours. And I mean, it sounds ridiculous to say, but this would have just flown right over the barrier, right? And so I think now New York City is starting to work on that, right? But they're so expensive. And I think this goes back to, just to wind it up, it goes back to the sense in which comprehensive fixes to these problems are so expensive, and they take so long in the current environment of federal funding that I think you're always going to be a little bit behind our current understanding of the risk when you're designing and trying to get these projects funded, right? So, and in the meantime, you have the disasters continue to happen and displacement continues to happen during the lifetime of just trying to move a project forward.
I agree with all that. It's always struck me as well, there's sort of a psychological issue here, right? That to a degree, giant core projects can serve to distract from the harder work of making communities better adapted by just building a giant structure that
Yeah.
will work
Yeah.
brute force, but maybe won't work as often or as well as people hope it will.
Right. I mean, the other issue is it works until it breaks. And when it breaks, it really, really breaks.
Yeah.
Right. Where if you have, flood sinks all over a neighborhood or a distributed sort of like soaking system to collect rain, if that gets overwhelmed, it gets overwhelmed by whatever percentage it couldn't carry. But if a storm wall gets overwhelmed, then the whole thing gets overwhelmed. That's very, very bad. Right. So there's that sort of like psychological disparity too.
I've got a question regarding NGOs. Can you talk about how disaster services organizations could positively impact this movement of people? It's a great question because I think of NGOs as helping people after a storm, usually helping them get back into their homes. Is there a role for the nonprofit sector to play and help them sort of facilitate and ease the movements of communities or people?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I think that I don't know how much of this ended up in the book, but, after Hurricane Maria, right, people from Puerto Rico ended up, I think there were people who resettled in all 50 states. I think that's correct, or at least the lower 48. And in places like Buffalo and Springfield, Massachusetts, they went to places where there were existing Puerto Rican communities. Sometimes they had families, sometimes it was just like where they thought they should go for temporary, maybe they had a friend. And a lot of them didn't make it back to the island. They chose to stay, in Springfield or in Buffalo or in New York City. And there were a bunch of organizations, in each of those cities that basically, they acted like normal sort of social service organizations in neighborhoods would, but they sort of took on this new emergent challenge of, okay, we have dozens of people, hundreds of people living in hotels on FEMA assistance that runs out after 18 months. A lot of them don't have the ability to go back yet. So what can we do? Can we help this guy get his CDL? Can we help this person get a job in the casino, which is the town's main employer? These are sort of like, it really was like more or less run of the mill social service provision, but they understood what was happening and they targeted their resources to ensure that people who were sort of crash landing in these communities could have. So yeah, this is definitely already happening. It's just not always named that way. And I don't know to what extent they were able to draw down funding, on the understanding that this is an emergency and that they had sort of increased needs. So there's definitely a lot of room for those organizations, which are already embedded in those communities, to sort of expand and flex a little bit and help when there's a receiving community that kind of has an influx of people and people need help resettling.
Yeah, just real quick before I go on the questions, you make a great point about FEMA. And if FEMA changes its policies about what kind of activities it'll fund, how much it would aid in the provision of those services. I'm also not aware of FEMA having any ability to fund NGO work in receiving communities over the long run, or how hard that is. But yeah, it's a great question, like policy being slow sometimes to keep up with the patterns. I've got a question here about community culture loss. It says, I haven't read the book, I'm sure that'll change, but what about Indigenous communities whose culture is tied to the land, or those who are unable to move due to various reasons? What do we do there? You want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really, really tough one, because and again, it comes back, I think, to the slowness of policy, but also to the limits of policy, where we don't have the ability to quantify the value of those intangible losses. And we don't even know how to start when it comes to making people whole. I mean, honestly, the conversation verges more toward the historical conversation about reparations than it does toward the conversation about disaster aid, right? Like I wrote about Pointe-aux-Chenes, the community right next to Ile-de-Jean-Charles, which is, they're not moving, they don't have this relocation thing, although people have left, but they don't have the ability to, grow the same herbs, raise cattle, trap for nutrient. All the things that sustain that community are now impossible to do because of coastal erosion. And, the federal government's definitely spent some money to elevate houses, et cetera, but I mean, there's nobody that you can appeal to for that. And so the best thing that they've been able to figure out is that they're trying to campaign to get the federal government to recognize them as an Indian tribe. And if they did that, then, you know, they would have a distinct rights to that specific land. But that's a very, very arduous process. It's really, really difficult to do. So yeah, I mean, we don't have the government doesn't seem to have an answer for that question, but there is a huge sense of loss, right? And it goes way beyond dollar values. It goes way beyond individual people. It's just, like you said, moving is really, really, it's just a sad event. And I don't know I really don't know how to think about that in terms of responding, you know, for the government responding. It's hard to know. Maybe you could put money into cultural preservation, but there's limits, right? There's limits there.
We got a question about utilities. I think it's a great question. It says, electric, water, and wastewater utilities have always had to consider decade-long patterns in population movement in their planning processes, but future large-scale migrations are getting bigger and faster. Do you see awareness among utilities in terms of the need to prepare for potentially enormous gains or loss of customers? I've certainly seen this, like a good marker of a town not having a great future is if the customer base of the power company or the water company shrinks too much and the company collapses. Do you sense that on like sort of these finer points that the institutions of our lives, like utilities, are keeping up with these changes?
Yeah, I mean, on the side that you mentioned, right, like in places where there's just been extreme depopulation, you definitely see, you know, financial turmoil for these utilities. And although they don't often seem to recognize it as driven by climate change, although they'll sometimes say, well, ever since this disaster, you know, people haven't quite been around here as much. On the other side, though, I mean, the utilities that are planning the most for increased population, right, are the servicers in the Southwest, which is still growing, right, and where there's not a lot of extra water for all the new arrivals. And I don't know to what extent. I mean, I've never heard a utility in what we think of as a receiving community for climate change talk about a near-term influx of people, you know, as a potential difficulty for its business model or for service provision, right? I mean, coincidentally or not coincidentally, the utilities in the, you know, upper Midwest or the Rust Belt, the places that are supposed to be the longest, you know, on the longest timeline receiving communities, they have quite a bit of fresh water. But, you know, there's also difficulties, like you said, with power and wastewater. Yeah, that's a great story idea. I don't think I've ever heard anyone mention that from a utility, but I confess it's not something I've delved into at the deepest level at all.
Because you mentioned it, I'm going to skip ahead in the list. There's a question saying, curious where Jake would put his money as the quote most climate safe city in the US. I feel like you've gotten this one before. What's your
yeah. I mean, it's usually phrased as where would you move, right? Which is a tough one. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think like there's risk and then there's risk, right? And every place faces some degree of risk. I mean, we read about climate change, we know that. But then there's places that just don't have the sort of perennial structural vulnerability to the things that we've seen so far, right? So if you just go down the list in the last 5 years, hurricanes, wildfires, droughts, severe floods, right? There's places that are much less vulnerable to those. And that looks like inland communities, temperate community in heat as well. And the upper Midwest, right? Like they have a lot of fresh water. They don't get hit by hurricanes. They don't really light on fire. It can get hot sometimes. It happened in Chicago in the 90s, but not as often, right? But I think, you know, not to be too scary, but those are the perils that we've seen. Those are the ones that we've already experienced, right? And I don't think in 2012 people would be talking about giant wildfires as the, you know, a main ingredient of climate change because they really hadn't happened that much in recent history in California. So I think there's a question of like, you know, yeah, on paper they look good, but you know, and you know, Duluth, Jesse Keenan did this thing in Duluth, Buffalo. There's a few cities that have sort of tried to make this a part of their brand. With what degree of success, I'm not sure. But I don't know. I mean, who knows, right? There's a big tail on climate change, even if you reduce emissions, and we just who knows what it looks like, right?
I just said, I traffic in doom and gloom, and I love the degree of doom and gloom you just dropped on this. The idea that sure, you can try and move somewhere that seems safe, but who knows what kind of threats they might face in 10 years that you can't even imagine yet. I
mean, I don't want to say it sounds like
know.
a movie or something, but it's true, yeah.
I also feel compelled to note, and maybe you found this too, the reverse is true, right? I'll go to places for stories that on paper seem like just the dumbest idea. You think, why would anyone live in a place as risky as this? And you show up and you think, oh my God, it's beautiful, right? Like at the first time I went to Dauphin Island, I thought, wow, like
The poster child for,
immediately I understood why people would want to live there, despite the incredible challenges that brings. And places in California hit by wildfire, you think, I get it, right? I don't understand people moving back there after being burned out, but I see why they'd be willing to take the risk in the first spot. So I don't want to be too dismissive of fire. I've got a few more good ones here that I'm really excited to hear your thoughts on. One that's come up for me. Will insurance companies write the de facto retreat policy? In other words, are insurers really the ultimate deciders about when retreat happens? Certainly you could make that case. Is that a role you see them playing?
Yeah, I mean, you wrote about this pretty extensive, I think, in California as well. I mean, that certainly seems to be, that's a role that they seem to be playing, maybe not explicitly, right? But the survival of their business model kind of requires imposing a financial disincentive on people who live in, these vulnerable places, right? But I think that, I don't want to say that they're going to write the retreat policy though, because there's another, there's counterparties that can fight back, right? So like in Florida, for instance, the insurance industry, for a lot of very complicated reasons, they were really there. A lot of them are trying to get out. They're collapsing. It's not a healthy market, but the governor and the legislature, they're taking, the steps that they think are right to try to keep them in the market and stabilize the market. And that sometimes involves, increasing the incentives. That sometimes involves like passing laws that prevent, the insurance companies from dropping. So they can't unilaterally decide to force retreat, although of course, if you end up without an insurance policy, your lender's not gonna be happy about that. And you're gonna have a difficult time getting a new lender. So yeah, that's definitely the direction that they seem to be pushing, but there's a lot of, I think, other things that can happen to push back, and a lot of things that happen before they actually just like, directly encouraging, large scale retreat.
Yeah, that's a great point. If I can just add one thing to that,
Yes,
I think
please.
concern I hear from policymakers is, okay, yeah, like the end result might be the same, right? If a piece of geography is not insurable, it's not going to be habitable, right? It won't have an economy that you want. But the transition is what matters. And the point I hear is what insurers are very bad at as sort of de facto policymakers is giving any sort of meaningful warning. If they're writing year-to-year policies, all of a sudden they can decide that's it, right? No notice that we are not going to write coverage policies in this area, and people have no warning, and it doesn't give you any kind of a sort of a timeline to plan and to move. And I think that sort of that shortcoming of the insurance as de facto retreat policymaker model demonstrates the sort of unique role of governments, right? And it's not always the role that government wants to play. I really like this next one, so I'm gonna just read it verbatim rather than trying to summarize it. Understanding the dynamics of risk is critical in these conversations with community members and leaders. Federal government is not very coordinated, in distilling climate science down to localized scales. What was the role of climate science in the reporting, and where do you think responsibility lies for managing and conveying climate science in the most effective manner for planning and relocation decisions? Who should people be looking to help them understand the climate science and decide when and whether to move? Obviously, journalists.
Reporters, but it's actually, I mean, I know, but I don't know, and I hope people don't get upset with me for this, but if you read the book, you'll notice there's very, very little scientific discussion in it. In fact, there might be almost none, except in the footnotes, right? And I tried to make and this is something that journalists try to do in print stories a lot, we try to make the link between the combustion of fossil fuels and climate change and the disaster that we're seeing. But I just kind of like more an experiment in the book. Like, what if we just kind of took it for granted that that's true? I read all the science and said, okay, this seems like the conclusion. Let me just have this in the background. and let me say, this is the basic relationship, but not go into it too much and just sort of show the on the ground impacts. That I think was like serviceable for this project, but as a general approach for journalism, it wouldn't really work. And I think that, yeah, I mean, it's tough because policymakers and government officials have a lot to do, right? They don't have time to become, in most cases, experts on scientific literature if they're in an emergency management department or something. But I do think that, journalists have a role, government officials have a role, and you do need to be informed about the science when you make these decisions. And, a lot of times a town will have a plan, like they'll make a plan for the town or a housing plan or a water plan, and they'll go into the science. I think sometimes though, people, they don't seem receptive to hearing about science from their elected officials. And so I think sometimes they feel like beaten over the head, or it gives them a lever with which to disagree with the government if the government says something about climate change. There's no doubt that the government needs to be informed. But I mean, at a temperamental level, it seems sort of like nobody really wants their mayor giving them a lecture about science. Or at least that's the sentiment I encountered, in places where the mayors, local officials have been pretty aggressive about this. But I mean, yeah, I think everybody has a role to play in that.
Yeah. Well, just taking that same question though, stripping out science.
Yeah.
If you take the question to mean who should regular people look to help them know when it makes sense to think about leaving? Because you mentioned mayors. I feel like mayors and local officials are the last people who will ever say, sorry guys, this is unsavable. And journalists, God bless journalists, but like, you're never going to find a journalist who's local enough to say, this neighborhood, it's time to leave. That'd be a weird thing to say. The federal government comes in when something terrible happens, but like, it raises the question, like, what is the right level of outside government that is both informed enough and objective enough and cares enough to help people make those really hard decisions, so it's not just left up to individuals to respond to shocks?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question, right? I think the other part is like, it's, even if you leave it up to, it's easy to say, let's leave it up to the community, right? Like, let's leave it up to the locals. But as you've experienced in your reporting, it's true, Princeville, North Carolina, for instance, or Ile de Jean Charles, people don't agree, right? People have really, really, really different opinions, and the opinions don't resolve into a community consensus. So, man, yeah. But it also seems like, I mean, this is kind of a cop-out answer, right? But I think that maybe a better approach for the government, or a best practice approach for the government, would be like, make sure that people have options, right? Like that there's everyone, no matter what they decide, they have like adequate support. But we don't have a lot of the history of coming in and saying, you got to go in this country is really, really bad. And it's never been done well, I don't think. Is when you say not, hey, you can, but hey, you must. I'm not aware of I'm not aware of it going down well. And so you could say, hey, it's okay if it doesn't go down well, we still need to do it. But I think that in some ways is like the conversation that needs to be had of like, not who can make this call with absolute authority and everyone will listen to them and it'll be okay. But like, at what point do you accept the risk of pissing people off and hurting people because you think that the benefits to the community of reducing the risk outweigh the downside? I know that's still not a good answer to the follow-up, but I'm struggling with that one.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of shifts, right? You can imagine a world where you get either enough communities do it well that people become aware of the option and they're interested, or B, the threats get so big that communities start to proactively seek out options to relocate. And then it's not so much the government finding ways to convince people to look at it. It's the government trying to figure out how to choose between multiple communities raising their hands, saying, help me first, which would be a horrible, I mean, things have to get so much worse for that kind of a flip to occur. But you can imagine at some point the federal government has to decide, how do we help people if there's too many people for us to help? I think we're coming to the end of the natural session here. This has been awesome. I got one last thing I want to ask, which is sort of a a prompt for you to just reminisce. It says, what was the most perspective changing or life changing experience in your work on this book? Did you have like one moment that stuck out in your mind that you want to regale us with before we all go?
Well, coincidentally, I was in South Louisiana when Hurricane Ida hit, and there were sort of two parts of it that were kind of crazy and perspective changing. One is that I went to Pointe-Noire right after and talked to people like the day after. It was just a mess, and it was I guess, you know, you see pictures and stuff and we report on this, so it's in our heads, but the sheer just the ubiquity of the destruction was really, really hard for me to process. And also just you could see people's attitudes forming in real time. I would ask, hey, you think you're going to stay? It's kind of in retrospect, a dumb question. But, you know, people say, well, I don't know. This is crazy. It's never been like this before, but I really love this place. Or hell no, I'm not leaving. But God, I don't know how I'm going to get back to this house. And you could see that we think about staying, leaving, making that decision. You could see just that turmoil in people's minds of everything at once, you know, both and neither. And that was really crazy. And then I was telling people in New York, where I live, I was telling people about this storm. And I was saying, man, this is unbelievable. And I was tweeting about it. And I wasn't getting a lot of, like, people just didn't seem to be listening to me. And then 3 days later, it hit New York and killed more people in New York than it did in Louisiana. And everyone was like, oh my God, you know what? And there was this other element of like, wow, you know, the places that we think are risky aren't always the places that are the most at risk. And I don't know, it was a weird one because I wasn't even there, you know, my house, you know, my street flooded, I wasn't there. Yeah, it's just sort of it was overwhelming, you know. It was like, wow, there's just so much that happens in these moments. It's just this froth of impressions and decisions and trauma. It's like you could never say enough to document it well. That was kind of the sense I had.
I want to close on my part by just saying thank you for this conversation and for the book. I mean,
Thank you.
Like, I never have to explain to an editor again what, like, is displacement a real thing? Yeah, go read Jake Bittle's book. Amy, do you want to say closing words? We didn't really nail that down at the beginning.
I do. I just want to say, one second. Be back. Yeah, I just want to say thank you to both of you and tell everybody to read the book. It's excellent. I read it this weekend. Couldn't put it down. But this was an incredible conversation. We've gotten incredible feedback, even in the middle of the conversation. And I think you guys should think about going to create a podcast or whatever the next step is in this journey. Because I think it's like, in some way, it's very therapeutic to hear other people talk about these issues and really try to get to the bottom of it. And we heard that really strongly from your book, Jake. So easy to read and so scary to think about what our fellow Americans have been going through. But thank you very much. Thank you to the co-sponsors who helped get people to know about this great event. And just a plug for tomorrow, the Climate Museum is going to have another book talk from Susan Crawford on race, water, and the coming storm. And it's last plug for the resources. If you want to learn more about any of these issues, let us know. And thanks again. Have a great night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.